Littwin and Adrienne Adams, the researchers who coined coerced debt. It will provide an overview of coerced debt and emerging evidence and relevant law and the gaps in the law, and with the purpose of creating an understanding about coerced debt. I would hand over to the experts to introduce themselves, starting with Professor Angela Littwin.
Hi, I'm Adrienne Adams. Thank you, Nkeiruka, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It is a pleasure to be here with you all for this very important purpose. I am a professor at Michigan State University. I have been working in the area of domestic violence focused on economic abuse and the economic effects of abuse for many, many years now. I've decided to stop counting. I began my work as an advocate in a domestic violence shelter where these issues surfaced for me as something that needed to be addressed at a higher level. And when I went to graduate school, that's what I decided to focus my career on. So I come at this from examining economic abuse, and Angie Littwin, who will introduce herself in a moment, comes to this from the perspective of consumer law. And Angie, I'll leave it to you to explain how we began to partner in your explanation, but I think that's important context here.
Yeah.
So, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Adrienne. Yes, I am also thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled that this is happening, that this exists, that coerced debt is enough of a thing now that there is a summit about it. And I'm honored to be part of the opening session. As Adrienne said, I'm a professor at the University of Texas, and I'm at the law school. And my background is in debtor-creditor and consumer law. In particular, in my research, I've focused on consumer issues for marginalized groups such as women, lower income people, people who file for bankruptcy without legal representation. I came into this work from a bankruptcy study where we screened the women, partnered women who had filed consumer bankruptcy for domestic violence and found a rate that appeared to be higher than the national rate. I set about trying to find out why and started interviewing various professionals, and everyone started telling me about what we eventually decided to call coerced debt. I was going to say one of the professionals so this can't turn into a small study, and my first article about coerced debt, and one of the professionals I interviewed was Adrienne. And we had this amazing 2-hour-long conversation in which it became very clear that our work was compatible. And at the end of the call, I said, hey, when I'm finished with this article, do you want to work together on this issue? And she said yes. And then here we are about a decade later, still collaborating. All right.
Thanks, Angie. So I'm going to share my screen and get us started with the presentation. Can you all see? Here, let me launch. Wait, let me stop.
We can see it, Adrienne, but it's not in slideshow mode yet.
Yeah. Get that. Well, let me do the slideshow version first. That will make this easier, I think. Sorry about that. Let me try again. There we go.
Adrienne is one of the most tech-savvy people I know. So if something's going wrong here, it's not her.
There we go. Are we good?
Looks beautiful.
Thank you, Sarah. So in this session, Angie and I are going to lay the foundation for the summit by providing an introduction to the issue of coerced debt and the need for a response. We are going to answer a number of questions in this session. I'm going to start us off by answering the questions, what is coerced debt? And how is coerced debt created? And then Angie is going to help us answer the questions, how common is coerced debt? And how does it affect survivors' lives? And what are relevant laws? And how well do they address coerced debt? So we're going to be sharing what we know and how we understand the issue from what the work that we've done, but we also want to hear from you in this session. So we're going to also have opportunities for discussion as well. So to start us off, I'm going to explain what we mean by coerced debt. So as we mentioned in her pioneering law review paper, in which Angie coined the term coerced debt, she defined it as all non-consensual, credit-related transactions that occur in a relationship where one person uses coercive control to dominate the other person. So what that definition illustrates is that coerced debt is a problem at the intersection of consumer credit and coercive control. I'm going to define each of these two terms. I'll explain first consumer credit from a very basic perspective, and then coercive control, we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth. So again, this is basic. It'll be review for most of you. I'm not going to go into detail here. The aim is to make sure that everyone understands what we mean by consumer credit. So the consumer credit is a system within which money is borrowed and agreed to be paid back. Credit's obtained through formal lenders such as banks or other kinds of financial institutions, and also informal lenders such as family or friends. It involves an agreement about when money will be paid back and how much the borrower will pay back. Typically, that's the amount borrowed as well as fees and interest. And then the credit that's used to make purchase becomes debt. So that second component, coercive control. Coercive control is a form of intimate partner abuse that involves the systematic, ongoing use of violence, threats, intimidation, isolation, and control to restrict the victim's autonomy and liberty. So coercive control is used to restrict a person's freedom to make choices for themselves, to direct the path of their life. One of the ways abusive partners exert control is through the use of economic abuse. Economic abuse is defined as behaviors that control a person's ability to acquire, use, and maintain economic resources, thus threatening their economic security. There's two general components or categories, buckets, however you want to think about this, in which economic abuse tactics fall. So there's economic restriction and there's economic exploitation. Economic restriction involves imposing limits on a partner's economic resources. So interfering with their ability to bring in income, dictating and monitoring their spending. So what they're spending, how much they're spending, where they're spending, hiding money or property, and withholding financial information. So hiding financial statements, not allowing access to bank accounts, things like this. And then economic exploitation involves using a partner's resources for one's own advantage. So it might be spending their partner's money, stealing a partner's money or property, or creating debt in a partner's name. This last tactic is what we refer to as coerced debt. Coerced debt is a form of economic exploitation. It's using a partner's credit for one's own advantage. Coerced debt often occurs alongside other types or other tactics of economic abuse. So for example, abusive partners who are creating debt in their partner's names also might hide financial information from them to keep them from discovering what they're doing. And Angie's going to talk more about that when she reviews some of our research findings. I've underlined the word coerced here because I think it's important to point out, to recognize, understand that the word coerced in the term coerced debt is referring to coercive control. Coerced debt is debt generated in the context of coercive control. So that brings us to the question, how is coerced debt created? In other words, how does this happen? So an abusive partner or an abusive individual can create debt in someone's name by taking out loans, using credit cards, or putting household bills in somebody's name, in their partner's name, among other types of debt. So loans include, for example, mortgages, vehicle loans, personal loans, payday loans, student loans, other types of loans. Credit cards can include major credit cards, such as a Bank of America Visa card. It can also include store cards, like a Home Depot card or an Amazon card. So brick and mortar stores, online stores. Household bills can include gas, electric, cable, internet, phone, even apartment rental leases. So those general household bills. There are three general strategies or common strategies or methods that abusive partners use to put these types of debt in their partners' names: fraud, coercion, and manipulation. I'll explain each of them. So fraud involves using a partner's personal information to take out credit in their name without their knowledge, without their permission. So for example, someone might buy items on Amazon using their partner's credit card information that was stored in the computer without them knowing and without their permission. Or someone might use a partner's social security number or their other personal information to take out a payday loan without them knowing. Coercion involves using force or the threat of force to compel a partner to take on debt when they would not otherwise have incurred it. In other words, coercion involves a demand and a threat of consequences for not complying with that demand. So for example, someone might ask, encourage, or pressure their partner to sign their name to a vehicle loan application with the spoken or sometimes, oftentimes even unspoken threat that if they don't, they're going to be sorry. There'll be some consequence. The threat may be physical, it might be psychological, it might be emotional or financial, just some harmful consequence that the person wants to avoid, and so they comply with the demand. The third method for creating debt is manipulation. Manipulation involves deliberately managing conditions or information to lead a partner to take on debt they would not have otherwise incurred. I'm going to share with you a quote from a research participant that illustrates how someone can manage conditions or information to get their partner to take on debt they would not have otherwise taken on. So this woman says, "When I came to this country, I don't know exactly how the loans work. How do you apply?" And when I wanted him to explain to me, he would say, "It's very complicated, so let me do it. Don't worry about it. Let me handle it." If he needed my signature, I'd sign it because I trusted him. He'd say, "Don't worry, we will pay it slowly, but this is how everybody do, so just sign." But every time I wanted explanation, he would say, "It's very complicated. So you are very, very busy. You have the baby, so just take care of the baby and let me take care of the finance. Let me take that stress off of you." This is how he would say it. So I would never know how much I would have in credit. And I've been asking him many times, like, how much? When I would ask him, he would say, "Like everyone has loans." But when I would ask him how much exactly, he would say, "That's too much information. You don't need it." So this is how he used to do it. He would minimize it like it was normal. So I never had any type of information, like this credit report. He would take everything. He had the key to the mailbox and would take every mail, like I would not have access to the mail. When I met this woman, she was in a shelter going through a divorce. The loans that she's talking about here were student loans. Her husband had told her what he thought she needed to hear in order to convince her to take out the student loans. And then he spent the money. So she ended up with unpaid tuition bills and substantial student debt in her name. So this is how coerced debt is created. Abusive partners use fraud, coercion, and manipulation to take out loans, credit cards, household bills, among other types of debt in their partner's names. Excuse me. And as I said earlier, debts generated through these three strategies are referred to as coerced debt when it occurs in a relationship where one partner uses coercive control to dominate the other partner. And I want to dig into this a little bit more. So this broader context of coercive control enables an abusive partner to generate debt in their partner's names through these discrete transactions involving fraud, coercion, or manipulation. Using coercive control, the abusive partner is creating an environment in which refusing a demand or questioning their behavior is dangerous. And I'm going to give you some examples of this. So this dark blue outer oval here represents coercive control. And to review, coercive control is the systematic, ongoing use of violence, threats, intimidation, isolation, and control to restrict a victim's or to restrict autonomy and liberty. So the smaller green ovals represent an individual fraudulent transaction, coercive transaction, and manipulative transaction happening within this broader context of coercive control. So first, I'm going to provide an example of a fraudulent transaction in the context of coercive control.
Ashley.
Let's say Thomas takes Sam's personal credit card out of Sam's bag and takes it to the mall and uses it to buy new clothes for work. Sam finds out about these purchases when Thomas walks back into the house with a bag of clothes from the clothes store and sets the credit card down on the counter. Sam knows from past experience that asking Thomas about those purchases is dangerous. Thomas gets angry, and Sam knows what can happen when Thomas is angry. So Sam says nothing. That transaction did not happen in isolation. There's a broader context surrounding it in which it's not safe to respond. Here's an example of a coercive transaction. So John wants a new vehicle, but his credit is not good enough to get a loan on his own. So John calls Michelle, his partner at work, and says, "Hey, meet me at the car dealer after work. I'm getting a new truck today." So Michelle shows up at the car dealership and finds that all the paperwork is filled out and ready for her signature. The car dealer hands her the paperwork and says, "Well, we just need your signature on it," and he's ready to go. So John explains that they had to fill out the paperwork in her name because his credit wasn't good. So all she needs to do is sign and they'll be all set. So Michelle tells him she doesn't want to sign for his vehicle loan. And John starts yelling at her, embarrassing her right in front of everybody at the car dealership. He's throwing a complete tantrum. This isn't something new in their relationship. Michelle has seen this type of behavior before, and she knows how it escalates. She signs the loan out of fear of what's to come if she doesn't sign it. So her experience with John tells her that this isn't something that she can say no to. Finally, for an example of a manipulative transaction in the context of coercive control, I'm going to refer back to that scenario that I shared in the quote earlier. So that woman's husband had told her what he thought she needed to hear in order to agree to the student loans. She wanted more information. She wanted to make an informed decision, but there was nobody else to ask. Since she had moved to the US with her American husband, she hadn't made any friends. Her husband had actively prevented her from doing that. So she was completely isolated. There was no one else in her life that she could check with to make sure that what her husband was telling her was in fact true about how loans work and what her options were. So that isolation helped create the conditions for this manipulation. So those are examples of the types of situation in which taking on credit in the context of coercive control can result in coerced debt. I want to pause here for a discussion. We want to hear from you all. Two questions that we'd like to pose to the group. First, what types of coerced debt are you hearing about in your work? And second, how are abusive individuals able to create debt in survivors' names? And in this discussion, we'd like to hear about different experiences based on the context of abuse. So DV, SA, trafficking, elder abuse. And also we'd like to hear about differences based on groups or populations, such as based on race, ethnicity, language, citizenship, sexuality, gender identity. Do you want me to continue sharing my screen for the discussion, Nkeiru?
Oh, it's fine. And anywhere is fine. You can just stop sharing. Yeah, for now.
So what are you hearing about in your work? What does this look like? How is this happening? What kinds of debt are we talking about? I will stop sharing so I can see everybody.
I can go. My name is Sahar Nakwi. I'm a client advocate at DAIA. We are a culturally specific organization, and the kind of debt that I have seen for my clients is somebody's being brought to US for marriage purposes to be used for, like, their credit is being used for businesses to sign up for loans, for business accounts. This is somebody, like, the abuser has done this multiple times. So using marriage or marrying immigrants who have no knowledge of finances or how systems work in the United States for the purposes of boosting business and personal business.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and that was very much the situation of the woman whose quote I shared. Very, very similar to what you just described.
I saw a comment that phone bills are happening more often. They're
phone bills. Someone says, Claire Mooney says, credit card debts, personal loans, fake checks, auto loans, utility bills, including phone bills. And then we have a question. How does former tenant debt, e.g., for example, where a survivor and abuser were co-tenants on a lease, fit into your definition of coerced debt or not?
Sorry, just looking for the question.
It's from John Dura.
Yep, I see it. Thank you. Yeah, that fits into the definition of coerced debt when the lease was put into both of their names, either through, could maybe through fraud, coercion, or manipulation. And also when there's a lease put in, I think of it also as, maybe this is, more form of economic abuse when partner prevents the rent or the lease from being paid and through various ways, using fraud, coercion, manipulation is another way that can happen. Angie, would you add to that at all?
Yeah, I would agree completely that would be a form of coerced debt, unpaid rent. And yes, preventing someone from paying, there's a million strategies somebody can use to do that. I'm also seeing a related comment about credit cards, people with credit cards being pressured to make their partner an authorized user. That is certainly something that comes up a lot, and that can also be manipulated as well.
We have a question from Sparky Abraham. Yeah, could you unmute yourself? Yeah.
Yeah, hi, thanks. My name is Sparky Abraham. I'm from Bethesda in Los Angeles. We do a lot of work around elder financial abuse, and particularly around programs that involve like door-to-door sales. And I guess I'm kind of wondering whether there's overlap and kind of where that overlap lies. I understand that kind of in order to be coerced debt in the way that you've defined it requires a sort of relationship and context. And I feel like we see like a broad spectrum of that, right? Like we have some cases where door-to-door sales people return over and over and over again to the house and like form a relationship. and then do essentially what I would call either, coercive, just maybe sometimes just straight up identity theft. Or sometimes it's just kind of like a single contact, but it's still got all of those elements, right? Like hiding the information, manipulating. So I guess I was just curious how that sort of fits into the framework.
Yeah, it definitely calls for the need to expand the framework in the way that we think about it, right? And that's part of what we need to bring out today and surface today. So thank you for sharing that. Somebody showing up and scamming and building a relationship with somebody to be able to manipulate them into economic loss, right? In some form or fashion, certainly could fit into a broadened framework for understanding this type of problem.
Yeah, when I present this work, I often also hear about elder abuse in the context of a caretaker or a younger relative who's helping out, putting debt in the elder's name as well.
And
We get that a lot too, sorry. But yes, in addition to the salespeople.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we have to remember that the definition, the framework that I just presented comes specifically from work in the area of domestic violence, of intimate partner abuse, right? So it's limited to those stories, those perspectives. And so now that we're hearing these other ones, it challenges us to think more generally, more broadly about how else might this be applied and expanded.
Yeah, I would completely agree. Yeah, I'm seeing lots of things that sound familiar, right? Where somebody opened a secret PO box that he only had access to, so she never saw any of the communication. We've seen a lot of that in our research, where the abused partner has no access to the mail or to online statements, et cetera. And I'll talk a little bit about that in my part of the presentation.
I was gonna say, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I was gonna say a story where a grandmother was kicked out of her home by her own son, and her son was always in these dealings where he would get sued. And so in order to prevent him from getting sued, he would put anything he has in her name. So that way he is not held liable for paying any kind of debt he owes or any liability that he owes. The grandmother she wasn't an immigrant, she was a citizen, but still she came into the country. She's a first generation, like she is for first generation. And so she came into the country not knowing anything, like literally about the system. She spoke English, she spoke Arabic, but still she did not have any idea of what to do, So she was always relying on her other kids to help her. And so that even she was also disabled. She had diabetes. She was disabled. So she wasn't able to go to the bank to see okay, what money do I have in my account? What is going on? She would always rely on her other kids to help her go to get to places. And so she was never in the know of okay, what's in my name? What is my son who is the abuser in the situation? What is he doing with my account? She would not know unless one of her other kids would go and check for her, because she was just not the most literate, but not the most obviously educated about the system, and was also disabled. So it's so manipulative and so deep. There's so many ways, tactics of financially abusing somebody and being in coerced debt. So it's just a big topic. Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that story. Yeah,
thank you.
It's just awful.
Yeah,
Yeah, we hear about parents taking on debt in their kids' names.
Right.
Even little children who then become 18 and find out that they have a bunch of debt in their name. It's not fraud, coercion, or it doesn't fit the definition as we just laid it out. Right. But again, it's one of these, there's these other contexts and other situations where this is happening.
Literally.
Yes, and foster youth. I hear a lot about that when I talk about this. I think that's another area where taking out loans in somebody's name is rife.
One thing Naomi mentioned is I'm Claire, DB Consumer Law Attorney for Legal Aid in New York. One thing my colleague Naomi mentioned, we're seeing a lot of issues with apps, which on the one hand, I'm all about accessibility to services, particularly in communities that have been redlined. On the other hand, sometimes this lack of accountability leads to a lack of protection as well. One thing that I have found useful is explaining to the general counsel of some of these, especially like Bitcoin based groups, that there is, a regulatory concern about failure to protect consumers. And that has actually been successful for me, pointing out that, there might be regulatory repercussions for failing to provide the safeguards that are required for financial institutions, whether they want to consider themselves a financial institution or not. I also saw someone said that they're seeing use of debt settlement companies, and that's something that I'm curious to hear about if anybody else has had success with actually getting remedies for clients in those situations, since that's been a big challenge for a lot of our cases. And a third point is Carrie Rudd was saying that they're seeing charges on existing accounts. So a lot of times the police or the banks will claim that, oh, well, they opened the account, so too bad, basically. I'm interested to hear, I have some ideas, but I'm interested to hear if others have had success with disputing charges on existing accounts, particularly where somebody's been an authorized user. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Claire. I think that's a good kind of segue transition into Angie's portion of the presentation and discussion, because we're going to start getting into some of the remedy side of this. So Angie, you want to take over?
Yes, I will do so. All right, I'm going to share my screen. So how common is coerced debt? Adrienne and I did a study with the National Domestic Violence Hotline with callers. We are also in the middle of a study that we're running ourselves with funding from the NSF, and where we've interviewed 188 women. Our research team has interviewed 188 women about coerced debt. We are still in the process of cleaning and analyzing that data, so we can't present from there. But having worked with this for a year of data collection is definitely informing our perspective on coerced debt as we talk about these things. So the hotline study, over a period of a few weeks, there were 10,232 callers to the National Domestic Violence Hotline. 8,033 of them were asked if they wanted to participate in our, 8,033 were female DV survivors over 18, which was our criteria. And then we ended up with 1,863 participating. We had to cut about 40, some because they were not in the US, others because their information was too incomplete, and ended up with a sample of 1,823. You can see we had a wide range of ages. The majority were between 25 and 45 years of age. And race, ethnicity, plurality of our callers were white, but it looks like the majority were people of color when you add Black and Latina callers, as well as the other callers as well. So in the study, we asked people, basically, did they have coerced debt? We asked them about fraudulent transactions and coercive transactions, and we basically screened them, and that's what I'm going to present here. So a little over a fifth of the callers who took our survey said that they'd found out about debt or bills that they owed that the abuser put in their name without her knowing. So a little over a fifth. We also asked how fraud was discovered. And as you can see, contact from the creditor was by far the most dominant means of discovering it. Some other important ones are credit reports, financial statements, Abuser confessions was another one with a small percentage. And divorce, right? Find out when their divorce attorney runs their credit report, for example. Of the people who discovered the fraud through creditor or bill collector contact, almost 70% received notice via the mail, and 24% got it via a telephone. We also asked people about coerced transactions, and 43% of the sample said yes, that they were pressured to take out credit in their name or buy something on credit when they did not want to. We, as Adrienne explained, we conceive of coercion as sort of two-step process, a demand to take out debt or buy something on credit, and then the threat of a consequence. And we get to the threat by asking, what would happen if you said no? And the answers here add up to more than 100% because many people said more than one thing. Around 2/3 of the study said psychological abuse. That could be behaviors ranging from name calling or threats to leave the relationship, all the way up to threats to reveal personal information, or badgering the caller relentlessly. Physical abuse, probably most of you know what that is. For our study, it ranged completely from things like slapping or hitting, all the way up to threats on the person's life. Economic abuse was things like threats to withhold money, threats using the financial restriction they already had in place, threats to sort of tighten that, also threats to kick somebody out when they had no other place to go. So if you put this all together, of the callers who answered yes to either fraudulent transactions or coercive transactions or both, 52% said yes, so slightly more than half of our sample. We also looked specifically about the types of consequences because we were thinking of this with an eye of which types of coerced debt could you actually try to bring a legal action about. And so when we combined all fraudulent transactions and all coercive transactions where the coercion was generated through a threat of physical harm, almost 1/3 of the sample still had coerced debt. We also did the same inquiry, but broadened it. I used a team of law students to code participants' responses and see whether they would meet the no reasonable alternative or no choice standard for duress law. I'll talk about later that duress is not actually going to work for coerced debt usually, but that we wanted to sort of think about the consequences that way. So that added consequences like threats to pets, threats to take custody of the kids, or a sense that the person was just going to do it anyway. So I said yes because I knew he was going to take my credit card behind my back if I said no. That kind of thing.
Sorry to interject, Professor Angie. There's a question for you.
Okay.
That asks, where's the question? Something about, what is it? Why did you choose to limit the study participants to women?
Yeah, so coercive control tends to be, and Adrienne, you can jump in on this too, tends to be a gendered phenomenon. It's, it can happen in gay and lesbian relationships as well, but within heterosexual relationships, most of the studies find that it's much more likely to be perpetrated by men and experienced by women. The domestic violence, just sort of general physical harm in relationships can go both ways. But once you look at the coercive nature, when it becomes more coercive, that's when you start to see this gendered pattern. Adrienne, do you want to add to that?
That was what I would say.
Okay, great. Yes, so when you expanded to consider consequences or threats that would be considered to leave the person with no reasonable alternative under duress law, then that took it up to 35% of our sample having experienced coerced debt. We also looked at one thing that we thought would probably be a precursor of coerced debt, which is hiding financial information. And 71% of our participants said that their partner had kept hidden financial information from them. So that was extremely prevalent. We looked and found that women whose partners hid financial information from them were 3.6 times more likely to have coerced debt. So there appeared to be a strong relationship there. You may be wondering how so many people found out about their fraudulent transactions via the mail or via creditor contact when so many people have hidden financial information. About a quarter of the women who learned of the debt via mail mentioned that they found rather than received the mail, right? They moved and got the bills sent there. The bills were sent to them by mistake. They beat the abuser to the mail one day. They found bills in the trash, or they waited until he wasn't home and went and dug through the backpack where they thought they were. All kinds of behavior like that, where you actually had to go looking for the bill in order to confirm it. How does coerced debt affect survivors' lives? We asked 2 questions about this. First, we asked if people's credit report or credit score had been damaged by the actions of a controlling partner. And as you can see, 46% said yes, a really high number. Another 14% said that they were not sure. We counted those as no, just to be conservative. And this was highly correlated with coerced debt. Right? Women with coerced debt were 5.7 times more likely to have their credit hurt by an abusive partner. How credit works. Most of you probably know this, but I'll just give a quick refresher, right? That somebody wants to borrow money and the lending officer says, I'll check your credit history. So they then turn to the credit bureaus, the main ones, the big 3, of which are Experian, TransUnion, and Equifax, who then pull the data they have on the loan applicant from their files, right? And that's the equivalent of the different people from whom she's borrowed money previously saying, she paid us on time, she paid us 30 days late. And that is what is going to inform whether the loan officer gives her the loan, or these days it's much more likely to be done by algorithm than by person. A credit score is, the snapshot of the credit report that happens on the day it was calculated. They run it through an algorithm and come out with a score that says how good of a lending risk you are. These are the FICO scores, which run from 300 to 850, and you can see the different patterns there. FICO also publishes the elements that go in a credit score. So the largest factor is payment history. Second largest is amounts owed. And then 3 other factors, length of credit history, mix of credit, and new credit, contribute as well. Coerced debt affects credit scores, and payment history is probably the most important way, right? Because we heard from lots of participants in our current study that their abusive partners prevented them from making payments. And that could be payments even on debt that's not coerced, right? That could be payments on other debt that the person is prevented from making. And then amounts owed, obviously coerced debt contributes there by increasing the amount of debt that somebody owes or is in their name. Why it matters, because credit is no longer used to determine only loans. It is also used to determine whether you can get employment, housing, cars, utilities, cell phones. In other words, all the things that somebody needs if she decides she's going to leave a relationship are suddenly unavailable if her credit has been ruined. And poor credit history can mean refusal to hire someone, hire or to rent an apartment to them, higher fees for services, and higher deposits from things like utilities. The other consequence we asked about was financial dependence. Nearly 3/4, 73%, said that they stayed longer than they wanted to in an abusive relationship because of concerns about supporting themselves or their children. So a really high number there. And coerced debt appears to influence that. Women with coerced debt were more than 2.5 times more likely to stay longer due to financial concerns than other women. So let's have a discussion, right? In what ways has coerced debt affected the lives of survivors in your work? And do you want to consider experiences based on the same context we talked about before? The context of violence, such as domestic violence, sexual assault, trafficking, and elder abuse, as well as specific groups, such as by race, ethnicity, language, citizenship, sexuality, or gender identity. And I will stop sharing for a few moments so that we can have a discussion.
How are we doing on time? I noticed that we're running a little bit behind. Do we want to have folks post in the chat and continue on? Or
okay, I'm happy to do that. What do you think?
Nkeiru, what do you think?
Well, this session was supposed to end at 1:20.
Yeah, 1:20. So maybe I should continue. And
continue, and then we get the questions at the end of the presentation. Okay. Yeah,
I can do that. So I have, hold on, you guys are in the way of me getting into slideshow mode. There we go. I've also been asked to talk about how well do current laws address coerced debt. That is going to be the subject of the remainder of the day, but so you can consider what I'm about to say as an introduction, and you will hear more in the breakout sessions and in the final session about state law changes. So there are a few laws that can be used to address coerced debt as coerced debt. So for example, common law duress is a doctrine that would seem to apply. The problem with duress is that even if the conduct meets the standard of leaving the survivor with no reasonable alternative, in coerced debt, the creditor is considered a third party who had no knowledge of the coercion, right? The credit card company had no knowledge that the abusive partner was putting debt in his girlfriend or wife's name, right? So duress law usually doesn't work. The law of divorce, property distribution, there are several problems here. The first one of which is that even if a family court were to assign the debt to the party who was culpable for it, that doesn't change the contract with the creditor if the survivor's name is the one on the debt. Further, in our study, we were interviewing women who had recently divorced a controlling man in Travis County, Texas, and we asked a lot of questions about the divorce process. And we haven't analyzed this yet, but anecdotally, something I heard a lot is that people were advised if the debt is in your name, you're not going to be able to get him held responsible for it. No matter how it started, or even if he opened the credit card in her name alone and she had no idea, attorneys would say, just don't even bother. If it's your name, you're stuck with it. Unauthorized use, right? So federal law allows people who have unauthorized credit card transactions to dispute them and have them and not be responsible for them. There's a few problems there. One, it only applies to fraud. And as you see, and this I think is going to bear out in our current research as well, coercion appears to be a lot more common. It only applies to credit card debt, although credit card debt is prevalent in coerced debt. The other issue is that the regulations around unauthorized use require the person not to have benefited from the transaction. And we asked about that, and we heard a lot of things about benefits that weren't really benefits. So for example, yes, I watched the TV, but I didn't think there was anything wrong with our old TV and would have preferred to kept that one instead of the giant one that he bought in my name. And also, I never got to choose the program. So it was a benefit, but it wasn't really a benefit. And then finally, restraining orders. If you are in a place where preventing someone from using your accounts can be put into a restraining order or requiring them to return your documents, then a restraining order can be preventative. But many places do not allow or encourage to put those kinds of things in restraining orders. So, I'm going to say I'm not talking about the new state laws because I will let, including the one in Texas, because I will let the folks at the end of the day talk about those. But so people are left with generally applicable consumer law, like the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, Fair Credit Reporting Act, the Statute of Limitations, exemptions and anti-garnishment rules, bankruptcies, and various state-specific consumer protections, right? So it's not very easy to deal with coerced debt as coerced debt, but you do have all of the tools in the remaining areas of consumer financial law. All right, so I have a couple more discussion questions, so you can hold the last one in your mind in our remaining 3 minutes. Also ask what you see and hear as the most pressing concerns of survivors with coerced debt, and what is working well when you try to address coerced debt, or what could work well were the law or policies to change. There's a lot to cover in 3 minutes, but we do have the rest of the day.
And it would absolutely be a great time to even lay out the questions so that you all can keep talking about it in those breakouts. So if you all have questions or seeds to discussion, that'd be great.
I put this a little bit in the chat, but I just wonder how people address the issue of when our clients seemingly ratify the unauthorized charges, whether they were fraudulent. I mean, in our cases, usually they were fraudulent. The client didn't know about them. I'm thinking of one client in particular who called to be like, I didn't make, what is all this stuff on my account? I didn't make these charges. And the Wells Fargo representative sort of talked her into acknowledging that it was her boyfriend that did it. It's like, oh, could anybody else have maybe used your card? And she's like, oh, maybe. She's like, was it your boyfriend? She's like, I guess so. And then they tried to use that in litigation to be like, she ratified the charges. And then luckily we got, actually I used a lot of materials that Carla sent me to try to put it into context. But that comes up a lot of times, I think, in these cases where the client maybe knew about it for a while but didn't know, or it wasn't safe to immediately be like, this was unauthorized, I dispute this.
Yeah, we see that. I mean, I think we can talk about this in one of the breakout sessions, because generally it is having to educate opposing counsel and judges on this dynamic, because they just don't get it. They don't understand intimate partner abuse, period, much less identity theft or coercion within that context. And so for us, it really has been like you doing the advocacy in court, in litigation and depositions and mediation, whatever, to explain that. And I've always wanted to have a test case where I get Angie or Adrienne as an expert to come testify. So maybe we can do that someday. But yeah.
So I want to piggyback with Carrie and Carla. And I'm from Houston, Daya, and we serve survivors of color from South Asian community and beyond. So what we see is the same thing, that power control, right? And recently we had a research done by Rice University students for the practicum on the financial abuse and all. And that found that majority of our clients are very unaware of the financial system here in the Western world when they come from their home country. So it is a fear that holds them to even understand that, unless somebody makes them understand. And of course, if there is abuser who's abusing or coercing, then that fear is much more, because she doesn't have any self-confidence, and she loses the self-confidence because of the power control and the IPV. So it is very, very important that the court system, the judges understand these cultural dynamics that hold a person from understanding the financial system here, let alone know what the abuser, he or she is, doing and coercing, because she's already fearful about the system that is very unknown to her, to the victim survivor. And oftentimes we have heard, from the court, that why is she not understanding, why he's not understanding, what is the issue here, right? So it is that becomes very important for us on the field, we who are seeing these survivors day in, day out, to advocate for them, to have the court understand these issues are not alien. These issues are real, and these issues are very, disempowering the survivors. And now it is you who should be empowering rather than disempowering them.
Yeah, well, thank you. That is a great note to end on. It sounds like Ted's about to jump in. I don't want to take up more time into people's break, so.
Yeah, thanks everyone for the end of that. We have to end the session so that we can take a break and then come back and dive into breakouts and really go into the meat of all the issues that you've brought up this section. So